Night falls, and the magic of words is burning firefly-like in the darkness. I'm the slightly under the weather gargoyle, your host for this evening session. Coming up in the darkness, I will be reading the work of Jane Buckley. So sit back and enjoy. And as always, the focus is on the words, never on the person behind the camera. And please excuse the voice this week. The flu got me badly. If you like this video, please consider subscribing, ringing that bell and commenting below. I am the gargoyle, your reader on the ledge. Stone's Corner Turmoil. Prologue. Stories were told in the barracks of the first tour of Londonderry in 1969, Operation Banner. The initial arrival of 300 troops from the 1st Battalion, Prince of Wales' own Regiment of Yorkshire, was at first welcomed and cheered by the Catholic nationalists. The regiment had been brought in to relieve the fatigued Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, which had fought a bitter 3-day battle in the bogside area of the city following a Protestant apprentice boys' march that resulted in serious rioting. The RUC had resorted to using CS gas, water cannons, and eventually guns, but could not quell the rioting. The nationalist bogsiders were jubilant and believed they'd broken the morale of the much-hated police and their auxiliary force, the B Specials, known as the Protestant Army. Within an hour of the regiment's arrival, the predominantly Protestant RUC left the chaotic scene, and naively, the British Army replaced them. Most Catholics believed the Brits had arrived to protect them and would be unbiased peacekeepers. Women even offered tea and biscuits to the young soldiers as they patrolled the streets in those first few peaceful weeks, known as the honeymoon period. Operation Banner was meant to be a limited operation, and at first, the army was gearless and ill-prepared. They looked almost comical in riot gear, previously used in Aden, complete with Arabic warnings written on the shields. Many senior Aden and Cyprus veterans treated Northern Ireland just like any other British colony, but soon they realized this war was different. Here it was impossible to physically identify the enemy. Here, everyone looked the same. In a short space of time, the atmosphere grew more tense and dangerous. People were terrified. Nationalists, loyalists, the RUC and the British Army were shooting or bombing in retaliation for the many atrocities carried out by all sides. Their escalating thirst for revenge could not be sated. Each group was angry and determined to obtain total victory. A few prominent loyalists were furious about the intrusion of the British Army. They were critical of the British government and felt Westminster was interfering with their province. The army was seen as being too soft on the nationalists, making very little effort to stop them, creating their no-go areas. In time, these disillusioned views changed as the army began to escort and act as protector to the many loyalist orange marches and protests. The honeymoon period was over. In February 1971, a young gunner was the first British Army fatality of the Troubles, and in retaliation, the Army introduced Operation Demeritus, or Internment Without Trial. On the first of many raids, over 300 suspected Republicans were arrested. So shoddy and out of date was the Army's intelligence, however, that some of those listed as Republican sympathizers had, over time, died. Not one Protestant loyalist was arrested until a year or so later. Internment proved to be a catalyst for a tidal wave of violence and protests by the furious Republicans. In January 1972, what soon became known as Bloody Sunday, the shooting dead by the British Army of 13 unarmed Catholic civilians and the wounding of another 14 people, one of whom later died, took place during a civil rights march in Derry. Chaos and violence continued throughout the province, leading to Operation Motorman, where the no-go Republican areas were finally dismantled by the British Army after 11 months. The Northern Ireland Parliament was suspended and direct rule was imposed by Westminster. In all, 500 people, just over half of them civilians, lost their lives in 1972. That year saw the greatest loss of life throughout the entire conflict. However, at that time, no one ever thought the bloody murders and bombings would spiral out of control and continue for decades. Chapter 1. September 1972, Derry, Londonderry. They were hyper, almost manic. All day they sat through briefing after briefing. Finally it was time. They agreed enough was enough. A few secret vodka shots added to their exhilaration as they prepared to leave the barracks, all with their faces disguised by camouflage paint. Some of the men climbed into Saracens or Centurions, while others went on foot, fighting to hold on to their berets as they filtered past 3 lit-up, stationary RAF Wessex helicopters, the ear-splitting din of their whistling blades sounding as impatient for action as the men themselves. The promise of air cover was reassuring. Tonight was likely to get messy, and the soldiers welcomed any backup they were offered. After Bloody Sunday and Operation Karkin, sorry for the pronunciation there, the largest British military initiative since Suez in 1956, they'd taken shit from every direction. Tonight was payback. They were ready. Fuck, they were ever. For Queen and country. Warning shouts were heard as the illuminated giants, resembling monstrous dragonflies, eagerly took off, one after another, powering through squalls of rain towards the west of the city. The remaining men and vehicles followed in haste. Within minutes, the line of flying predators reached their destination and hovered menacingly for a moment before descending, lower and lower, upon the streets of back-to-back terraced houses. The downdraught from the whirling blades rattled doors and windows in their frames. The few working streetlights struggled to stay intact against the battering they received. Steel rubbish bins clattered and scraped over tarmac as they and their contents were blown about the pathways. Almost immediately as the racket started, the street's occupants began to wake in terror, struggling from sleep, one after the other, to lurch out of bed and switch on the lights. 19-year-old Catherine McCaughlin was luckier than most, not snatched from sleep, but already lying restless and awake in a single bed. Against the bitter chill in the barely heated house, she lay with her legs bent up against her chest and arms clasped around them, shivering beneath the doubled-over blanket. She couldn't sleep for worrying about her brother Martin, wondering where he was and, more importantly, if he was safe. He had been arrested recently, and the family had heard nothing. At first, she wasn't quite sure what was causing the commotion overhead, but quickly recognized the sound. A helicopter, and it was right above the house. The noise and the buffeting sensation became overwhelming as the roof tiles and windows shook and banged in protest. Caitlin clapped her hands over her ears against the relentless assault. Feeling dazed and disorientated, she sat up and pulled back the thin floral print curtains to look down upon the chaotic scene in the streets. A probing searchlight shone menacingly through her window. Its beam quickly scanned up and down her bedroom walls, over her bed, and stopped when it reached her. She defiantly tightened the cardigan she wore over her nightdress as she glared challengingly at it. The light remained fixed on her for a few short moments until, as if disappointed in its find, it mercifully moved on. Caitlin could hear the frantic voices of terrified women and children screaming from the houses that backed into their street, and a sickening squall of tires, along with male voices, raised intimidatingly. Her heart hammered with fear as she watched the dimly lit road swarm with soldiers and police, army saracens and jeeps, lit up with powerful spotlights, sped erratically along the narrow road, stopping at random to park halfway across the pavements. Several armed men clambered out of the vehicles, some running to take cover and observe, while others filed purposefully towards the pebble-dashed houses. A large number of police struggled to hang on to their overexcited German Shepherd dogs, frustrated at being held back and salivating at the end of their leashes. Urgent hand signals passed back and forth between the raiders as they cautiously assessed their surroundings. In pairs, soldiers strode up garden paths towards front doors. The street dogs barked furiously and snapped at the heels of the darkly dressed shadows, who impatiently kicked them away, cursing, fists hammered against unanswered doors, no sooner followed by the sounds of splintering wood and smashing glass. Loud, confident English voices cried out names from lists brandished in gauntlet hands. Protective mothers frantically tried to bundle small children under the stairs for fear of them being trampled underfoot or callously brushed aside by the soldiers forcefully entering their homes. They searched living rooms, kitchens, and bedrooms for the men on their lists, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Furniture was needlessly shelved over, drawers were shaken out, and cupboards emptied with a sweep of an arm or the kick of a boot. Sorry for that. In their hallways, shocked and shaking, the women stood in nightclothes and bare feet, watching the brutal violation of their homes. Some tried to soothe crying, half-asleep children, or wordlessly clutched their babies to them, only to be pushed aside as the gun-wielding troopers continued their onslaught. In house after house along the street, every light began to blaze as more and more front doors were rammed open and dazed men and women were hauled pitilessly and harshly from their beds. Many of the screaming wives attempted to snatch their men back from their aggressors, but were struck aside mercilessly by batons. Sorry for that. By now, Caitlin was shaking with terror. This was the worst she had ever seen. She jumped as her younger sister, Tina, erupted into her room, her fiery red hair bristling and freckled face tight with indignation. "Jesus, Caitlin, you got to come," she said indistinctly, struggling to remove the braces she wore on her teeth. "The Brits are at it again. It's another raid. It's going to be murder." She yanked her braces free and shoved them in the pocket of an old school blazer she pulled on over her pajamas. "The bastards are lifting loads of boys. Just seen them grab wee Joe by the hair. They hammered him and threw him in the back of a pig. Caitlin, Mommy's going crazy. You better come. She's off on one. Daddy's in bed. Sure he can't get up. Tina, not again, Caitlin cried, remembering the night of her brother Martin's arrest. She rubbed her eyes, still dazzled by the brilliant light, and looked around the room for something warmer to wear against the bitter cold. Seeing her father's heavy Aran jumper lying on the floor, she'd been wearing it earlier that evening. She quickly pulled her cardigan off and yanked the thick woolen jumper over her head. It reached down to her knees. Without pausing to find any shoes, she pushed Tina out of the door ahead of her. On the landing, they were met by the sight of their wide-eyed, defiant mother, who stood at the top of the staircase, supporting herself against the wall with one hand and the banister with the other. It was clear Magella McLaughlin had been drinking again as she let go of the banister to fumble nervously with the silver crucifix that hung around her neck. She swayed dizzily. The woman simultaneously jumped in fright as the furious knocking below, followed by a rending, smashing sound as their front door was broken down. Within seconds, 2 soldiers in battle dress appeared at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at them from features smeared and semi-obliterated with dark paint. They started to climb the staircase as Magella screamed abuse. In the background, Caitlin could hear her father's voice raised in panic, demanding to be told what was going on. She froze. With his leering blackened face and huge lumping boots, the late soldier was a figure from a nightmare. The sleeves of his camouflaged combat jacket were rolled up slightly, and Caitlin glimpsed a flash of red on his forearm, a sort of tattoo. He was clutching the wooden stock of his rifle close to his chest. She could see its white, handwritten issue number. Below it, a baton slung ready for use on the tight green webbed belt. Unlike his partner behind, who was tall and gangling, he was short and compact, his neck bull-like and bulging with muscle beneath a thin mesh scarf. His naturally protuberant eyes swelled with excitement. Instinctively, she sensed danger and a hatred that emanated from his whole being. Her mother stopped her abusive rant and leaned closer as she approached. With her face just inches away from his, she hissed almost triumphantly, "You stupid bastard! Our Martin's not here. You already got him." She lashed out with the full force of her ringed hand and struck him hard on the cheek. "Get the fuck out of my house, you English bastard. Leave us alone. Fuck away off back to wherever you crawled from." The soldier didn't bother replying. Using his free arm, he thrust her aside, sending her spinning against the wall, where she knocked her head hard. Blood gushed from the wound and streamed down the side of her face. Caitlin rushed to her and examined the injury. It was small, but deep. Magella's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when they reopened, she had trouble focusing them as she slid down onto the floor. Caitlin knelt down and looked up to see the soldiers touch his face to assess any damage. The rings had cut his cheek, and it was bleeding. He stared at the frightened woman with his cruel eyes as a malicious smile crossed his face. He said nothing, but shook his head in silent reproof. Immediately, Caitlin knew things were going to get worse, much worse. Her father continued to cry out as the soldiers quickly nodded to each other and removed their batons for the ready. The bleeding soldier began to search the upstairs bedrooms while the others stood waiting and watching the woman carefully. That is all for this evening session. Again, sorry for the voice. I really hoped you enjoyed this, and thank you so much to the author Jane Buckley for this excellent story. If you want to read more of her work, I'll put a link below the video. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And as always, I am the Gargoyle, your reader on the ledge.